So I'm so excited you guys are here. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jessica Anderson. I'm an accessibility specialist with Center for Accessibility and Disability Resources. You may have seen in the program that I was going to have a co-presenter, Jordan. She's the director of our TAP program on campus. She's unable to be here, so it's just me. Um, but a little bit about myself is I've been here at NDSU. I'm just starting my 5th year. And I've been working with students with disabilities for about 15 years. I spent the majority of my career in the K-12 world as a special education school social worker with middle school students. And here I'm in the Center for Accessibility. So why this topic is important. This is just a little bit of a breakdown of what we see at the Center for Accessibility. Students that are reporting a documented disability that they're sharing with us. So as we know, with any disabilities, there's several students that aren't sharing or reaching out to Center for Accessibility, but this is the numbers that we have. We have 867 current active students through Center for Accessibility, and then based on their primary or secondary diagnosis, which is why these numbers don't add up to 867, because some students have more than one diagnosis. This is a little bit of the breakdown. So really large numbers with anxiety and depression, but ADHD is close to the top in terms of students that we serve. This is a shift even from 10 years ago, where the numbers were a lot more focused on learning disabilities, and now is a little bit wider variety. Before I kind of dive into things, I just want to start with saying that I want everyone to trust their own experience. You are the expert in your topic. You are the expert in your field. This is just some additional information, some tools for your toolbox, but by no means direction on how to conduct a course that you're already an expert in. What this presentation is about the impact that some disabilities can have on communication, specifically talking about communication, and then how some social expectations and hidden norms in the classroom can shape interactions that we have with students that have some barriers with communication. And then I'll share some flexible communication strategies that we can use to support all students that can promote more successful engagement in the class. These aren't necessary for every student every semester. These are those semesters that you may have a challenging student in your class where you're noticing some communication barriers and you're looking for what can I do kind of around that area. The session is not about lowering educational standards or adjusting conduct expectations. All students with disabilities are held to the same standard as neurotypical students. So what are some of these disabilities that can have an impact on communication? I like to say that this is just a broad overview. It's going to feel like a lot of generalizations. If you've met one student with a certain disability, you have met one student with that certain disability. Every student is different. Every student will present different, and they may not have the same barriers as some of the barriers that I'll talk about as we go through this slide. So first, anxiety. When it comes to communication, the biggest two areas I see with anxiety would be in that realm of public speaking. I had a student come in and share with me that they went up to give their presentation and they said their vision started to close in and all I could see was a really narrow path. They could hear their blood pounding in their ears and the professor was talking, but they couldn't understand them. So they just left. So they ended up in my office saying, I think I got to quit this class and probably drop out of school because I just walked out on, I was supposed to be giving a presentation. He did not have to drop out of school. And we can problem solve around that, but that's how significant public speaking can feel to somebody that has anxiety around that area of public speaking. And then selective mutism. This one I like to bring up because it can feel very disrespectful. This is where you maybe ask a question and the student doesn't answer, and you ask again and the student's still ignoring you. You're like, oh my gosh, I know you can hear me. You're sitting right here. And that kind of inability to be able to answer is anxiety related. Speech disorders, with speech disorders, with some speech disorders, there's struggle with being able to articulate what it is that you're thinking. So the processing is there, you have the answer, you know the information, but there's a delay in being able to say it out loud. With other speech disorders, there can be a struggle with understanding. And this often comes with a co-diagnosis with anxiety, can lead to that public speaking anxiety of students that don't want to share out loud because they're afraid people won't understand them, don't want to talk with their professor because they're afraid that that inability to understand will lead to kind of a reflection on what they do know, when that isn't always the case. ADHD. Students with ADHD may present in their communication as a little bit scattered. They may ask about something that's already been said. They may start sharing about one topic and end on a totally different topic. Sometimes these meetings in my office last like over an hour because we'll start talking about accommodations and we'll end up like talking about how their aunt got a cat on vacation. And sometimes they can struggle with seeing or hearing those subtle social cues. So maybe not necessarily seeing that it's time to end the story. Traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injuries, we see students that have a permanent brain injury. We also see students that have temporary concussions. Think of our D1 sports. We get some concussions coming out of that area. With traumatic brain injury, there's some processing time delays. And the other biggest impact is on memory. So that would be that repetition in questions, asking again for the answer. Something I really like to say about traumatic brain injury is with a lot of other disabilities that we see in our office, the focus is on helping students learn information or helping students show they know information. With a traumatic brain injury, the barrier is genuinely memory. Like the memory is what's impacted. So accommodations look a little bit different, and the reason why there's that repetitiveness is a little bit different. Students on the autism spectrum. This is my area of expertise at Center for Accessibility. I work with the students that are on the autism spectrum, and symptoms are, it's a spectrum. So there's a wide range of students, but autism can impact processing time, some rigid thinking. I like to describe it as like buckets. As a student, as they learn information, they kind of create these buckets of information. And then when they take in information that doesn't fit into one of the buckets that they have formed, it can lead to some dysregulation. Well, they struggle to figure out how it does fit in. And that dysregulation, we'll talk a little bit about that as we continue, can look a little bit different depending on the student, but can definitely have an impact on communication. There's also some missing social cues and maybe unawareness of the impact of their dysregulation on their peers. Students with intellectual disabilities, this is also a range, can be mild intellectual disability to more profound. On campus, this would have been Jordan's topic. Most of our students with intellectual disabilities are supported by the Transition and Access Program. Transition and Access Program actually had their first graduating cohort just this last weekend, which was a ton of fun. Starting this next school year, we'll have 24 students on campus. We do have a handful of students that have intellectual disabilities on the higher functioning side that aren't supported by Transition and Access, that just work with Center for Accessibility for Accommodations. Intellectual disabilities can also present as processing speed, taking longer to understand information, genuinely processing information differently. So they take in the information and understand it in a different way. And kind of an interesting note in comparison with students on the autism spectrum, intellectual disabilities are a little bit less rigid. Students are typically more open to answering the same question multiple times in different ways, where a student on the spectrum might be like, you already asked me that, I'm not answering it again. And sometimes it might take that little bit of digging and asking a question in a different way to try to get the answer that you're looking for. So considering these disabilities, what are some examples of social expectations and hidden norms in the classroom? These are things that a neurotypical student may intuitively know or easily adapt to, but for students with certain disabilities may pose some challenges. Things that like classroom structure. So classroom structure, by no means should we not have different classroom structures. We should, of course, have different classroom structures based on what works best for that classroom, but just recognizing that that initial change might pose a little bit of a challenge. So if a student is used to lecture-based classes and then they end up in a discussion-based class, that would be an area that could lead to some increased stress or an exacerbation of disability symptoms. Flipped classrooms can be amazing for learning, can cause a lot of stress for students with certain disabilities. Changes in modality. I had a student on the autism spectrum that signed up for an in-person class, but before the class started, it changed to be an online class. And oh gosh, like within an hour, I had the student in my office. I was on the phone with the mom, the grandma called. Everyone was like really up in arms about this because that's how much stress that type of class change can cause students when they're processing this kind of change that a neurotypical student might not feel in the same way. Norms like when to ask questions, when is it okay to ask? Can you interrupt throughout the presentation? Should you save your questions to the end? When to share information and how much information to share. Reading the room, maybe recognizing the difference between a class of 20 students and what's appropriate to share with a class of 20 students might be different when you have a class of 200 students, and kind of some struggle with recognizing that difference. Picking up on subtle social cues. That could be like the student that's sharing a long story and other students in the class are rolling their eyes or giving some like exasperated sighs. The student's likely not picking up on some of those social cues. And the impact of their words. A story about that, especially when a student's dysregulated. I had a student that came into my office and they were a little bit distraught and they said, I just had a kerfuffle with my professor. I was like, oh no, what happened? And they said, I really don't know what to do next. And I said, okay, tell me about it. Professor came up to me and asked why I wasn't paying attention in class. And I said, well, it's because I hate your class. And I said, you can't say that. I go, why? Okay. We got some teaching, we had some reteaching to do here. So just that missing understanding of the impact of their words. When you may see an increase of students with disability struggling. So when some of these things may pose a little bit more of that dysregulation, right at the beginning of the semester, thinking about those changes in modality, establishing some of your classroom norms. If a student hasn't had you in class before, if they had you in class, but it was a different structure of class, that can be a time where there's a challenge. First exams or big project due dates, those are times when stress is increased, maybe not fully understanding expectations is increased. A lot of asking and re-asking occurs during that time. And then mid-semester, especially if there's midterm exams, or finals time, especially if there's a final. These are times where in the Center for Accessibility, we're seeing that increase of students coming in too. So what are some of those flexible communication strategies that sometimes can be supportive in some of these situations? So first is just to presume positive intentions. Students are here because they want to learn. That's the biggest difference that I've seen from students here that I work with in Center for Accessibility versus my 10 years in middle school. Those students really wanting to be here and wanting to learn the information. And if we all approach conversations with students with that in the back of our mind, it It helps shape the conversation. And I'm always telling students that about professors too, when they're nervous about going to talk to professors. Like, professors want you to learn, assume their positive intentions. No one's here to like make you fail a class. And same with the students. So just recognizing even if their questions are repetitive or obsessive, or if they say something maybe a little bit rude, their intention is still that they want to be here and they want to be learning that information. And then be genuine, say what you mean and follow through. Speaking of middle school students, this is something middle school and college have in common, is students can sense fake from like a mile away. And students will come in and tell me that too. They're like, they just recognize that when a professor is pretending to be somebody they're not. So just being yourself is where students have really positive experiences in classrooms. Patience. So patience can be a little bit tricky, especially in some of those one-on-one conversations. So maybe giving a little extra wait time for responses. If we go back to some of those disabilities we were talking about and those delays in processing speed, or that delay from being able to hear the question and then say the answer, being comfortable in that little bit of silence that comes in. Maybe offering an alternative way to respond. And this would depend on how it fits into the conversation. But thinking again of some of those disabilities with the processing speed or with some of the genuine barriers to communication. Something like, here's the information that I'm sharing with you, even if it's one-on-one. All right, does that all sound good? Go ahead and give me a thumbs up and we'll move on with the next thing. Can be just a simple way to cue in on if they understand the information rather than a verbal response. Or why don't you take a minute to think about that? You can write down your answer, hand it to me at the end of class. Nobody wants more emails, but you could always say, why don't you take a time to think about that and then go ahead and send it to me, your response in an email. It just gives a student a chance to process the information and fully understand, and probably give you a more accurate response based on what they're truly thinking. Lead with the positive. If a student thinks that you think that everything they're doing is wrong, it can really exasperate symptoms of their disability. An example, this could be for a student that's maybe nonstop talking in your class, just like the constant talking. If you have them come and talk to you after class and you just say, I need you to stop talking. The student, that could be tricky, but if you frame it a little differently, like, I'm so glad that you come to class every day and that you really enjoy engaging with this material. I really enjoy working with these students that love learning, but there is something we need to problem solve. I need you to give a chance for other students to share as well. Like, it just comes off a little bit different. A student can respond to it a little bit differently. Be predictable. Obviously every class can't be the same, nor should every class be the same. But even sometimes the small things, like a similar greeting, arranging the desks in a similar way, can make a difference. If something is going to be way different, like if every class period you sit in the same desk, but you have a class where maybe you have 5 guest speakers coming in and everyone's going to be arranged in pods, then giving a heads up about that. When you come in on Wednesday, the desks are going to be arranged in a different spot. So the student has time to prepare for that like unpredictableness. But if a student knows they're going to walk into class, they're going to sit in this spot, the professor is going to walk in and say, good morning, let's take out your textbook. That adds an air of just calmness, like it gives a steady start. Clarity is kindness. This is something I used to say with the teachers I worked with all the time. And sometimes I think, especially in the Midwest, we get a little bit nervous about clarity, about telling people what to do, making things clear. But sometimes intentionally setting up those course norms, even saying them out loud, clear rules and clear expectations. Students know what's expected in class. They know when the question and answers are supposed to happen. They know what the consequence or natural consequence would be if certain rules aren't followed. Those can kind of lay the groundwork to actually ease some of the nerves that may be coming if a student doesn't understand it feels like they have to guess. And a student that struggles with guessing or reading the room or picking up on the social cues, it can cause more of an increase in behavior rather than kind of the opposite. There might be a need for some individual conversations to help clarify expectations. Some examples of that, especially, again, thinking of those students that you maybe want to pull aside and talk about the excessive blurting or the talking in class or the long tangents, like some of those things. Try to use if-then statements, thinking of students that I work with that are on the autism spectrum, or some students with certain disabilities. They're going to have learned about if-then statements all through K-12. Like that's going to be an approach that they're familiar with. So it could be something as simple as, if you have a question during class, then write it down and share it with me at the end. If you've already answered 2 questions, then allow your other classmates to answer first. If you've already tried some of those, and you're kind of at the next step. If I feel you're continuing to be disruptive, so other students are struggling to learn, then I will need to ask you to step out of the class and we can meet during my office hours. This also gives a good chance to talk about some kind cutoffs. This goes back to students really missing some of those social cues, and students that are missing social cues where maybe their classmates are rolling their eyes or giving sighs that they're not picking up on. That's not only impacting their relationship with you as a professor, it's impacting their relationships with their classmates. Those students really want a kind cutoff. Like that would be helpful to them. And what a kind cutoff could look like is something that you determine with the student on what works. But if you have answered too many questions, I will ask you to please give someone else a chance to answer. That will be your sign to not answer any more questions that day. Or if I've seen you've answered too many questions, I'll come over and give a small tap on your desk with like a small head shake so you know that we're done answering questions for the day. Or maybe I'll make eye contact with you and put my hand up. That's your sign to know that we're done talking today. Students, again, it feels unkind, but it's protecting that relationship with the professor, and it's protecting that student in their relationship with their peers. So that's one option. You may have to say an expectation that feels obvious. Thinking of those one-on-one meetings too. Don't try to assume that the student would know that without being told. An example of that is I worked with a student that had a professor, and the professor said, if you have any questions, email me anytime, which was a really kind thing to say. Well, the student emailed the professor 60 times in one weekend. The professor called me on Monday morning. It was like, oh my gosh, make it stop. What's happening? So I had the student come in and I said, all right, we really can't do that. Well, he said, like, email them anytime. I'm like, let's come up with some parameters around this. Can you write down your questions? Can you email them at once? What was happening is the student was having questions as they were working through their homework, but they were answering the questions before they got to the end of the homework. So I don't know, 9 out of 10 of those emails were irrelevant because they'd already figured out the answer. So if the student wrote down the questions and only emailed what they genuinely had as questions at the end, it cut down the emails by a ton. The student ended up getting an A in the class. The professor ended up not losing their marbles. So sometimes saying an expectation that seems like it should be obvious helps. Like it kind of solves the problem for everyone. Expect generalizations. This is helpful to know because, one, students are paying a lot of attention to what you do, and like they're gonna kind of hold on to that. So kind of knowing that, like if you say an expectation, try to follow through on the expectation, because if you don't, that's kind of a new rule that the students created. This professor doesn't follow through on what they say, even if it was only like one thing. But the other reason it's nice to know this is sometimes it's not actually about you. I had a student that had went to a TA's office hours and the TA wasn't there. Probably that one time. Of course, it was just the one time that they were pulled into a different direction. But this created this new rule where the student said, I don't go to TA office hours, TAs aren't there. So you could overhear that. You could overhear that about students saying that about their TA. They could overhear it about them saying it about a professor. And it might not actually be about your TA or about your professor. It's kind of this generalization that maybe came from an experience. And then it takes time to teach and reteach and rebuild that kind of understanding. And that's part of what I can do with students of, why don't you try again? And then, gosh, I sure cross my fingers that when they try again, the TA's in their office, because if not, then we lost it. But just kind of building slowly on those experiences. Avoid qualifying words. Things like should, maybe, possibly, sometimes can be understood in a different way by certain students with disabilities compared to some students that are neurotypical. An example of this is a professor wrote on an exam, here's the question, you should use this method to answer the question. The student used a different method to answer the question and then lost all their points. And they were really frustrated with me at saying, well, why did the professor say I should? He didn't say I had to use that method. And that's something that we would assume and isn't always something that, like, those qualifying words feel nice, but they can make it challenging for students to fully understand what somebody means. Did they mean maybe, or did they mean have to? And then offering information in multiple formats. Sometimes reading works better than listening, or vice versa. Being able to re-listen, reread, rewatch can make a big difference for students, especially students that struggle with some processing. It may help the student from asking repetitive questions because they know where they can go to access that information that they maybe missed. It also can help you as professors to be able to redirect some of, like, the frequent questions by saying, it's on page 2 of your handout. It's on page 2. Like, it just gives you a reference point if it's offered in multiple ways. I still have a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to answer any questions. If there's any specific situations that you're curious about or want to problem solve, I'm happy to listen. And then for the questions, I'm also going to leave my slide up at the end. This is my contact information in the Center for Accessibility, but also our office's information. We are available anytime to problem solve. Sometimes we do those teaching and reteaching moments with our students in the office too. We don't know that something's going seriously wrong if no one tells us something's going seriously wrong. So reaching out, even if it's not a challenge in an accommodation or anything that you want anyone to be in trouble for, you just want to brainstorm. I'm here for that. I love to do that. So there's our contact information. Yeah.
Do you find that a lot of the students, when they're preparing to graduate and then getting into the workforce, are they comfortable going to the employers and talking about getting accommodations? And obviously the accommodations that a workplace might provide might be different than, going to class. So do you see that as that they are comfortable doing that? Because I have a family member that had a really hard time asking for additional time on assignments and things like that. And now I'm going to be looking for a job, and I'm just worried that she's not going to bring stuff forward.
No, students aren't overly comfortable with that. But that is something that we try to, while they're working with us in our office, help build some of those self-advocacy skills. And it grows a lot, like self-advocacy through college. In K-12, everything is really done for you in terms of special education. Your parents go to meetings, your parents and case manager leads meetings. Everyone's talking about what works for you and what doesn't. And you're just kind of either there and listening, or sometimes you're not even there. And that's the K-12 world. So then you come to college and everything's on you as the student to send your accommodations, to tell what you need, to fail. Like students with disabilities have the same right to succeed or to fail as other students. And that's different than K-12. K-12 is success oriented and students get supported until they succeed. Here, we ensure you have access, but if you have access and you still fail, we can problem solve and we can work around that. So all that to say, in answer to your question, is there's a lot of growth that happens in 4 years of coming in from everybody else kind of navigating your disability for you to now you're here and you're the primary person that needs to advocate for your disability. Year one, parents are always coming to meetings, and it's a lot of redirection on my part of talking to the student. And the parent answers the question and say, oh gosh, thanks for that information. So, and then I'm talking to the student because we're really re-engaging this and retraining. How do we have conversations? By senior year, parents aren't coming anymore. Like even students that parents were super involved at the beginning, students are popping down by themselves and having those conversations. Still sometimes making phone calls, but way less hands-on, which is a step in the right direction for employment. So building that confidence, encouraging students to feel confident in talking to their employer, but also recognizing that sometimes it takes a student a minute to figure out what they need, what workplace accommodations might look like, and to feel comfortable kind of asking about that takes time.
Thank you.
To piggyback on that, just because you made me think too, if an employer prompts a question, like we tell during the interview process to ask all your applicants, do you need any type of accommodation? Or if you have a new hire, do you think that would help somebody if the question is being prompted by the employer to say, hey, do you need any accommodations? Would that help them be more comfortable, do you think?
Yes.
Okay.
Also, I can see in an interview process, especially for some hidden disabilities, they might still not disclose at
Yeah,
that time
for sure.
with fear about the interview.
Right.
Will be received. But I think it at least opens the door for conversations.
Yeah.
And shows that the employer cares about things like that. So even if it's not the time for the conversation, it's kind of setting the tone for where you're getting involved. All right.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
They asked, do you have any guidance on how to approach sensitive subjects like personal hygiene?
Oh, that's so hard. I think that if you kind of take these same tips and presume positive intentions, think about that the student also doesn't want to be ostracized by their peers or by their professor. And that clarity is kindness. It's gosh, I really love that you're here. I love that you're engaging. This is so important. I can see it. You're learning this information. I do have a problem that we need to problem solve. And what I'm noticing is sometimes when you come to class, your personal hygiene hasn't been taken care of. Is there ways that we can do that so we can make sure that you're comfortable in groups with people, and so we can make sure that classmates are feeling comfortable in the class? But sometimes that can help. You can always reach out to. I've had those types of conversations with students, and I'm happy to do so. I know that through like the Dean of Students office, they've had those types of conversations with students and are happy to do so. So if you feel like maybe you're not the right person to be having that type of conversation, it's okay to bring somebody else in. But sometimes, like if you have that kind of rapport and relationship with a student, it feels like they're in less trouble. If you just have like a quick, we're all okay here. I'm just letting you know that this is a little bit of an issue that we're having. It might be better received. So, but again, kind of back what I said at the beginning, trust your experience and trust your knowledge of your course. You'll know if it's the right time for you to reach out or if it's the right time to bring somebody in.
One of my courses is online asynchronous,
Sure.
and this is my first year doing it. And where I really struggled is getting students to reach out when they are struggling. You know, I tell them in my introductions and all this, I'm like, we're here to help you. We want to help you. But I'm like, you have to tell me because I can't see that you're struggling, right?
Yeah.
That's the hardest part. When there's assignments missing, I reach out and like I had a student reach out to me during finals week last week. That was way behind, hadn't done a bunch of stuff. She gave me pages of why.
And valid reasons.
Yep, and they were, I'm like, why didn't you, like I've reached out to you 4 different times this
Yep.
semester and that just made it worse was, she's like, I made my, and so I'm like, I don't, any advice on how to handle those situations and to help themselves if they're struggling. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of where I'm at. Anyways, I'll quit rambling now.
No, that's like such a genuine concern. And I hear that from other students too, or students that come into my office finals week and say, can you please email my professor for me and ask for me to make up these like 10 things? I'm like, no, I can't do that. And so it's something that they're also hearing from me or anyone else in my office right from the beginning is we don't know if there's a problem if you don't tell us. So I love that you're doing that you're setting it that way. Please keep reaching out. Like in the odd chance that there's a student that does make it worse, it's probably helping 10 others. Like there's going to be a bigger benefit from students knowing that you care than there will be from a student feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the reach out. My other recommendation, if you know it's a student that's working with our office, and it might not be, but if you know that it is, reaching out to us and just, because I've had that happen before too, where a professor will say, hey, I just wanted to let you know the student hasn't turned in their last 2 assignments. And then I can reach out to that student based on that relationship and rapport that I have with them, and say, gosh, I'm just checking in, what's going on? And maybe can problem solve around some of those areas with them. And then it goes back to clarity with kindness, which doesn't feel like the nicest thing to say, but then the answer is no. Like I laid clear expectations for you at the beginning of the course. I let you know that this is what the expectation was. This is how I was going to handle it. This was the reach out. And now you're asking and all your reasons are valid, but so were my initial expectations. And I just can't during finals week take in all of this work. And that helps the student in their next semester. It feels really icky in the current semester, but I'll have students that will do that, unfortunately, like every semester. And then professors say yes, and they scramble and they turn in all the things and they get their good grade. And then the next semester they do it again. And then they get junior or senior year and they have a professor that says no. And then they're like, I'm not going to graduate. This professor said no. I'm like, but you didn't do what you were supposed to. But they kind of learned this like bad habit. So having that clarity, having the expectations and following through can really help students learn in the long run. While offering kindness and flexibility where appropriate. But a little bit of both and trusting your judgment and your experience.
It's setting, I work in HR, it's setting them up for success in the workplace too, because if you're not having that conversation and you're not building that relationship with them, and I know it's hard because you're not in class with them. And we have remote workers too, but if you don't have that relationship with them that they can come and talk to you about when they're struggling and you're not initiating it, that's where it gets to the point where it's at the review and you're telling them all the stuff that they're not performing and yeah.
And they're surprised.
And they're surprised. And that's because nobody said anything to them. Yeah. So.
That accountability piece is so tricky and it's so hard to find the fine line between offering extra support and kindness, but also having the clarity and the follow through. I don't have a good answer other than to recognize it's really challenging. Gosh, I think we're out of time.